Welcome to Malifaux University. 408. Terrain. Destructible, severe, and hazardous. Malifaux is a rich, immersive experience with intricate models. When well-painted models are put on a well-decorated table, the game is even better. Terrain can be tricky, and it comes with many layers of rules that affect gameplay. This video will explain what destructible, severe, and hazardous terrain does. Video 407 covers dense and concealing terrain. Video 409 addresses terrain with the impassable and climbable characteristics, and Video 410 covers height and blocking and the shadow those traits create. This applies to terrain that is placed on the table during setup, or markers that are created or dropped during gameplay that have these characteristics and therefore are considered terrain. Destructible terrain, quite simply, is terrain that can be removed with the slam general action. This is usually applied to crates, sections of fences, and other fragile items that otherwise block movement or line of sight. When a model is within 1 inch of a piece of destructible terrain, the slam general action can remove one such piece of terrain. If there is more than one piece of destructible terrain within range, the player must choose only one to remove. If a model or marker is on top of that piece of terrain, it falls straight down to the surface of the playing area, taking damage if appropriate. As is normal in Malifaux, there are models with actions and abilities that break these rules. Union miners, for instance, have the Demolitionist ability, which allows them to remove all destructible terrain within an inch of themselves when they start their activations. Other models, like Sadir Alchibal, have the Blow It to Hell action, which drops a blown apart marker, which also removes all nearby destructible terrain. For everyone else, though, they have to either live with the terrain or remove it one piece at a time with slam. Severe is a term often heard in Malifaux, and can refer to the strength of a card or the amount of damage dealt by an attack. In regards to terrain, there are no variables involved, but there is some math. When terrain is severe, movement across it takes twice as much as normal terrain. You can do the math by either cutting the movement in half, or by measuring the distance and doubling it. As long as the effect is the same, it costs twice as much movement to cross severe terrain. Movement effects that place a model, such as flight or unbury, are not impacted by severe terrain. In a game, most water features and woods or forests count as severe terrain. Let's say the Nightmare Enforcer Coppelius is in this severe forest. His movement stat is 7, and he's 1 inch away from the edge of the forest. If he goes deeper into it, he can move 3.5 inches with one walk action, which is half his movement stat of 7. Remember that a 30mm base is about 1.2 inches, or 1.25 inches if you don't want to deal with decimals. If he heads out of the forest, it takes 2 inches of movement to cross the 1 inch of severe forest, and then about 2.5 inches to get his base all the way out of the terrain. That leaves him with 2.5 inches left in his walk action, which he may now take normally. Later in the encounter, he's trying to beat an iron skeeter to a strategy marker on the far side of a 2-inch wide severe water feature. The iron skeeter has flight and a movement stat of 7, so it simply places itself 7 inches away like normal. Coppelius walks the ½ inch to the water, spends 4 inches of his movement crossing it, and spends his remaining 2.5 inches of movement getting out of the water because it takes twice his base diameter to get all the way out. The last terrain characteristic for this video is hazardous. This is for terrain markers or areas of terrain on the table that will hurt you just for touching them, and usually includes features like scorched earth, toxic slime, and barbed wire. Usually, the terrain has a condition listed in parentheses like burning +2 or poison +1, but if the description just says hazardous, then it does just 1 damage. If the terrain does have a condition listed, then the terrain does that instead of ordinary damage. Meaning, if this red cap walks through this toxic slime that is hazardous poison +1, it gains the poison +1 condition, but doesn't otherwise suffer immediate damage. If the red cap then walks through this barbed wire fence, which is simply hazardous, It suffers 1 damage after completing its movement. Keep in mind that some models affect hazardous terrain in what may seem like counterintuitive ways. Riva Cortinus, for instance, has the Funeral Pyre ability that drops a 50mm hazardous burning +1 pyre marker when she kills a model. She also has the Spirits in the Flames ability that lets her say that any pyre marker, whether she dropped it or not, is also hazardous shielded +1. This would mean that when she touches a pyre marker, she gains both burning +1 and shielded +1. As strange as this might seem, her Embrace the Flame bonus action lets her reduce the burning condition to heal herself and nearby models, leaving her shielded condition for other damage reduction. Just like a model cannot be affected by more than one aura of the same name, a model cannot be affected by more than one terrain marker with the same name. If the red cap model goes through 2 of Riva's pyre markers in a single movement, it suffers the effects of 1, gaining burning +1, not burning +2. This does not apply to terrain on the table that is not a marker. So if there were permanent fire pits marked on the table that counted as hazardous, burning +1, and the puppet ran through 2 of them in a single movement, it would finish the movement with burning +2, or burning +3 in this case, where the red cap already gained burning +1. The timing of when to resolve the effects of hazardous terrain are particular, but don't have to be confusing. The main idea to remember is that the effects set in after the current action or ability is resolved. If a model moves through or into base contact with hazardous terrain, it suffers the effects at the end of the movement. If a model is already in contact with hazardous terrain and takes an action, it suffers the effects after that action is complete, even if that action removes the terrain. Let's look at some examples to see these rules play out. Our little red cap uses his Rush ability to add 2 inches to his charge, and runs 7 inches through 2 pyre markers that are hazardous, burning +1. It ends its push in overlapping base contact with the second marker, and since charge is a push that generates a free melee attack, the red cap gains burning +1 now that its movement is done, but only +1 since it can't be affected by 2 pyre markers at once. When it takes a swing at Vincent St. Clair with its huge sickle, the puppet gains burning +1 again because it completed another action while in contact with the hazardous terrain. Let's say the red cap is part of Zoraida's Neverborn crew, and later in the game she casts Obey on the flaming puppet and gets the burnout trigger from a crow in her flip. She has the red cap swing its huge sickle one more time, but the red cap doesn't gain burning +1 quite yet. Hazardous effects are applied at the end of the current action, and the current action is Zoraida's Obey, not the red cap's attack. The attack is resolved, then the burnout trigger is applied, doing 2 damage to the red cap and giving it fast. Assuming the little grim doll survives that, it now gains burning +1 because it completed an action while touching hazardous terrain, but the effect wasn't applied until Zoraida's action was complete. In another game, Asami Tanaka, Shintaku, has dropped some hazardous destructible rift markers. If our red cap winds up moving into contact with one of these, it'll take 1 damage since the marker is hazardous, but there are no other conditions associated with the hazardous characteristic. If the red cap then takes the slam general action to remove the rift marker, the marker goes away, and the puppet takes 1 more point of damage from the hazardous marker since it completed an action while in contact with the marker. The last situation in which a hazardous marker can do damage to a model is when the marker is moved into contact with 1 or more models. A simple example can be found with Jedza, Everlasting, and her geode markers, which are blocking, impassable, and hazardous. If she has one of these on the table, she can target it with her Dredge Up tactical action to move it up to 4 inches. Since it's impassable, it cannot overlap or pass through other models, but let's say she moved it into base contact with both of these red caps. The Dredge Up action says she may take her Death Touch attack against one of the redcaps, drawing range and line of sight from the geode marker. Once that is finished, both redcaps suffer 1 damage for being in contact with the hazardous terrain when the action is completed. Take note that the model taking the action that moves the hazardous marker may choose to ignore the hazardous effects for itself if so desired. It does not have the option to not apply those effects to other models, though. This is only for the model taking the action. If Jedza had started out in base contact with the geode marker when she moved it to the redcaps, the situation would play out the same for the Grim Puppets, but with the added effect of Jedza also taking a point of damage for resolving an action in contact with hazardous terrain. However, she could choose to ignore that hazardous effect if she didn't want to take the damage, but she has several actions and abilities related to taking damage and healing, so she might want to take the point and achieve another effect. Some models can generate hazardous terrain around themselves, such as Amanozako and her Miasma of Boils and Flies tactical action, which produces a 4-inch aura of severe hazardous terrain around her until the end phase. If there are enemy models within that aura when she moves, or if she moves close to an enemy model that winds up within that aura, those enemy models do not immediately suffer the hazardous effect, which in this case is just 1 point of damage. For a model to be immediately affected when hazardous terrain moves, it must be from a hazardous terrain marker, not just an aura. When those models later activate within that aura, that is when they will have to deal with the hazardous effects. Remember that if a model is killed by the effects of hazardous terrain, no model or crew gets credit for having killed that model, even if that crew made the markers that killed the model, or if the hazardous terrain is an aura like the one around Amanozako. Also, some models get to ignore hazardous terrain, such as with Mei Feng, Foreman's Hazard Pay ability. This means that model ignores only the hazardous effects. If there are other characteristics to the terrain, like severe or dense, those still apply. If Mei Feng were inside Amanozako's Miasma of Boils and Flies, which is severe and hazardous, Mei Feng could choose not to suffer damage from hazardous, but would still see her movement cut in half from the severe effect. That's the overview of Destructible, Severe, and Hazardous Terrain. Pick up a printable set of all the markers and tokens you need to play Malifaux in the Wargame Vault. If you haven't already, join our Patreon for early, ad-free access to all new content, and be sure to visit the Malifaux University gift shop for the latest in Malifaux-themed shirts, hoodies, drinkware, and more. Links are in the notes below. And remember, play friendly games, keep it simple, and have fun.